right, folks, we're on to chapter 4, the Carew murder case. So, up until this point, the story has been about a dwarfish man who trampled a girl and maybe is blackmailing Dr. Jekyll. Not really a crime and detection novel by definition. There's no real crime unless you consider trampling a girl a crime. Well, this chapter is where the crime really takes place, the Carew murder case. That word murder tells us what's going to happen in this chapter, sort of broadcasts it to the world. So we're going to jump into the reading, and this is going to thicken the plot quite a bit. Nearly a year later, so some time has passed, in the month of October 18 blank. All right, let's talk about 18 blank. In a lot of novels written during this period, they like to leave the year blank, so it's not set in a particular year. Even in stories that were written earlier, it would be 17 blank, and so you can fill it in. So you can imagine that it's happening this year. Seems kind of strange now that we're in the 2000s, but just pretend it's like 1886 or whatever year it was written. That's fine. All right, let's begin again. Nearly a year later, in the month of October 1886, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity, and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. The details were few and startling. A maidservant, living alone in a house not far from the river, had gone upstairs to bed at about 11. Although a fog rolled in over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane, which the maid's window overlooked, was brilliantly lit by the full moon. It seemed she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. Never, she used to say, with streaming tears, when she narrated that experience, never had she felt more at peace with all men or thought more kindly of the world. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged, beautiful gentleman, aged, I suppose, beautiful gentleman with white hair, drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him another and very small gentleman, to whom at first she paid less attention. Now you can tell who the little and small, or the very small gentleman is, right? Our stumpy little man, Mr. Hyde. But let's look at the other guy. This chapter is called The Carew Murder. So clearly this other guy's name is Carew, but he's an older man with white hair, and he looks beautiful to behold. So he's like, I don't know, George Clooney or Richard Gere or some older actor walking down towards them, beautiful in his old age, I guess. Let's see. When they had come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, the older man bowed and accosted the other with a very pretty manner of politeness. It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it seemed at times that he was only inquiring his way, but the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet with something high, too, as of a well-founded self-content. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognize in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master, and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a heavy cane, with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. And then, all of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back with an air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt, and at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And the next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Well, so attractive elderly gentleman walking down the road from one side, Hyde walking from the other. They meet directly underneath the maid's window, and they start talking, and the old man's like asking for directions, and apparently Hyde is like, how dare you ask me for directions, and just beats the man to death with his cane and starts jumping on him like an ape. The cane blows are so savage that the maid could literally hear the old man's bones snapping. That's a horrible detail. And the body like jumps up and down on the pavement as it's being beaten. I mean, like that's just absolutely brutal. And she fainted. Now, let's take a second. Old novels, especially old British novels, Women faint all the time. Let me tell you that I have been alive for 43 years and I've never seen a woman faint. Not once. But this is an accepted part of the cultural, and you see it in a lot of stories that apparently women get overcome with emotion and faint. It's not real, folks, but it's an affectation of British culture, especially of the time period. Women were considered to be more emotional and all these kinds of things that don't bear out in actuality. But whatever, she faints. Um, it was 2 o'clock when she came to herself and called for the police. The murderer was gone long ago, but there lay his victim in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled. The stick with which the deed had been done, although it was of some rare and very tough and heavy wood, had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled into the neighboring gutter. The other, without a doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and a gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers except for a sealed and stamped envelope, which he had been probably carrying to the post, and which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. So apparently, this Mr. Carew was a client of Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, and he was taking a letter to him to the post office and asked for directions on where to find the post office and got beat to death by Mr. Hyde. So that's sort of the background. Now, how does Mr. Utterson get involved in this? Probably the letter. I think we're all connecting the dots here. This letter was brought to the lawyer the next morning before he was out of bed, and he had no sooner seen it and been told the circumstances than he shot out a solemn lip. "I shall say nothing till I have seen the body," said he. "This may be very serious. Have the kindness to wait while I dress." And with the same grave countenance, grave, means serious, but a guy's dead too, so yeah, anyway. And with the same grave countenance, he hurried through his breakfast and drove to the police station whither the body had been carried. As soon as he came to the cell, he nodded. "Yes," said he, "I recognize him. I am sorry to say this is Sir Danvers Carew." Sir means this guy has been knighted. So the old man who was murdered was a knight, somebody who Queen Victoria had raised to the level of knighthood. "Good God, sir!" exclaimed the officer. "Is it possible?" And the next moment his eye lighted up with professional ambition. "This will make quite a deal of noise," he said, "and perhaps you can help us to the man." And he briefly narrated what the maid had seen, and showed the broken stick. Mr. Utterson had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when the stick was laid before him, he could doubt no longer. Broken and battered as it was, he recognized it for one that he had himself presented many years before to Henry Jekyll. The plot thickens. The stick with which Hyde beat the old man to death is actually a stick that belonged to Jekyll that clearly Jekyll has gifted to Hyde. "Is this Mr. Hyde a person of small stature?" he inquired. "Particularly small and particularly wicked-looking, is what the maid calls him," said the officer. Mr. Utterson reflected, then raised his head. "If you will come with me in my cab," he said, "I think I can take you to his house." Remember that when they had that brief encounter on the street, Utterson said that he wanted to see Hyde's face so he could ID him. And Hyde said, "You might need my address to fulfill the will," and gave him his address. His address, remember, is in Soho, a bad part of town. Anyway, where were we? It's not a bad part of town anymore, by the way. It's like a fashionable place to live. Weird how times change. It was by this time about 9 in the morning, and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-colored pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and routing these embattled vapors, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvelous number of degrees and hues of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of rich, lurid brown, like the light of some strange conflagration. And here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. Now, this is, I think, all metaphorical for what's going on inside Utterson's head. There's a lot of turmoil. Fog always means mystery, right? Like weather, a storm is conflict, and rain is rebirth or sorrow, right? So like weather always represents symbolically some emotion, and fog is confusion or mystery, and that's clearly what's going on here. But also, when you look at the scenes and the colors, nighttime, darkness, sort of lurid brown colors, a conflagration like a fire, um, and every now and again a haggard shaft of daylight pokes through the fog, like maybe he's getting a clue or something. So you can sort of see where Stevenson's going with this. Anyway, the dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers and its lamps which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like the district of some city in a nightmare. The thoughts of his mind, besides, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers which may at times assail the most honest. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house. That's probably code for whorehouse, right? A shop for the retail of penny numbers and two-penny salads, many ragged children huddled in doorways, probably orphans, and many women of many different nationalities passing out key in hand to have a morning glass. And that's weird, too. The women are going out to get a morning drink of many nationalities. Like, clearly, I think we're seeing some of the inherent sort of cultural racism going on. This is a bad part of town, so of course there's multinational people there. Right. But this is a product of its times, and we've got to understand it that way. And the next moment, the fog settled down again upon that part as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favorite, of a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. That's a lot of money. Sterling means in silver, so clearly we've got a lot of money. £250,000. Remember that 100... In my false equivalency, $100 was equivalent to $1,000 now. So $250,000 would be $250,000 now, $25 million by like that standard. So the guy Jekyll is loaded. He's always been loaded. An ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman opened the door. She had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. "Yes," she said, "this was Mr. Hyde's, but he was not home. He had been in that very night, but he had gone away again in less than an hour. There was nothing strange in that. His habits were very irregular, and he was often absent. For instance, it was nearly 2 months since she had seen him till yesterday." "Very well, then. We wish to see his rooms," said the lawyer. And when the woman began to declare it was impossible, "I had better tell you who this person is," he added. "This is Inspector Newcomen of Scotland Yard." Scotland Yard is like the FBI of, Victorian times. A flash of odious joy appeared upon the woman's face. "Ah," said she, "is he in trouble? What has he done?" Mr. Utterson and the inspector exchanged glances. "He don't seem a very popular character," observed the latter. "And nay, my good woman, just let me in. Let me and this gentleman have a look about us." In the whole extent of the house, which but for the old woman remained otherwise empty, Mr. Hyde had only used a couple of rooms. But these were furnished with luxury and good taste. A closet was filled with wine. The plate was of silver, the napery elegant. A good picture hung upon the walls, a gift, Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who was much a connoisseur. And the carpets were of many piles and agreeable in color. At this moment, however, the rooms bore every mark of having been recently and hurriedly ransacked. Clothes lay about the floor with their pockets inside out. Lock-fast drawers stood open, and on the hearth there lay a pile of gray ashes, as though many papers had been burned. From these embers the inspector disinterred the butt end of a green checkbook, which had resisted the action of the fire. The other half of the stick was found behind the door. As this clinched his suspicions, the officer declared himself delighted. A visit to the bank, where several £1,000 were found to be lying to the murderer's credit, completed his gratification. "He may depend upon it, sir," he told Mr. Utterson. "I have him in my hand. He must have lost his head, or he never would have left the stick, or above all, burned the checkbook. Why, money's life to the man. We have nothing to do but to wait for him at the bank and get out the handbills." So, They get to Hyde's rooms, and a bunch of papers have been burned, including a checkbook, which wasn't entirely burned up. And the other half of the stick was there, and so clearly he's the guy who did it. Um, I think this is interesting. And the officer's pretty convinced that they just wait at the bank and put out the handbills. Those are the wanted posters. Get the wanted posters out, and we'll catch Hyde in no time. This last, however, getting the wanted posters out, was not so easy of an accomplishment, for Mr. Hyde had numbered few familiars. Even the master of the servant maid had only seen him twice. His family could nowhere be traced. He had never been photographed, and the few who could describe him differed widely, as common observers will. Only on one point were they all agreed, and that was the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity with which the fugitive impressed his beholders. So they try and make the wanted posters, and they try and find out, get some associates of Mr. Hyde to help them draw the picture and verify what it looks like. But it turns out he doesn't have any friends. He doesn't have any family. Nobody can find his family anywhere. Most people have only seen him once or twice, and when they describe him, there's a wide variability in what they describe, except that everybody feels he's deformed somewhere, but they can't say where or how. So they can't get good wanted posters out. And he never comes to the bank and gets captured. And that's the end of chapter 4. So Sir Danvers Carew is murdered. He's a member of Parliament. He's a knight. It's kind of a big deal. Mr. Hyde is implicated, so now Mr. Hyde is a wanted felon, a murderer, but he can't be found. Nobody can catch him. And so we have finally sort of entered the stage where this has become a true crime and detection story. We knew something fishy was going on, but now it's even more clear. All right, anybody who has questions, let me know. There's not a lot of themes going on here or stuff like that yet because we don't have enough information. We're still gathering information alongside the protagonist to try and figure out what's going on.